This is the new 2022 Volkswagen GTI, and it's the 8th generation of Volkswagen's high-performance GTI hatchback. The famed GTI has been around for almost 50 years, and it's generally regarded as the gold standard of the hot hatchback. And now there's an all-new model, and today I'm going to review it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era, now with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And you should, because we've had some fantastic sales lately, including this BMW M3 Lime Rock Park Edition, which sold for over $95,000, setting a record price for an E92 M3 sale. We also recently sold this Jaguar F-Type R for over $65,000 and this fantastic Corvette Z06 for almost $65,000. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool, interesting, modern car from the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. Check it out at carsandbids.com. So let's talk GTI. Like I said, the original GTI came out almost 50 years ago, back in the 1970s. And these cars have always followed roughly the same formula, combining hatchback practicality with extra performance. The new 22 GTI starts around $30,000, and it has a 240 horsepower turbo 4-cylinder and a 6-speed manual transmission, or a dual clutch automatic if you prefer. And on paper, that sounds great. But this car isn't perfect. It does have some very obvious flaws, which I'll show you. And today, I'll also show you everything else. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the new GTI and show you all of its quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a DOUGSCORE. Alright, I'm going to start my review of the new GTI by discussing its flaws. There are two major flaws with this car, and I want to talk about them at first to kind of get them out in the open and discuss why they're so important and why they're getting so much coverage. The first big flaw with this car is the technology, and primarily that relates to this center infotainment screen. There have been a lot of complaints from car reviewers about this screen. So many that you would think this screen like ran over the car reviewer's dog. It's not that bad. It really isn't. But there certainly are some glaring drawbacks, the biggest of which is the integration of the climate controls. Now, in a lot of cars, you have a center screen, but the climate controls have their own space below the center screen, so you can adjust that, you're using it often, without having to go into the screen, but not in the new GTI. To adjust the climate controls, you have to press this button here marked Clima, and that pulls up the climate controls in the center screen, and then you can adjust things from there. That on its face is kind of disappointing. You can't just change a simple climate function without at least a two-step process, going into Clima, and then that menu pops up on the screen. Other cars have integrated their climate controls into the infotainment system, but usually like in a fixed place at the bottom of the screen where it's easy to always find what you're looking for. Not the case in this car. You always have to first pull up the climate screen and then start making your adjustments. Now, it's worth pointing out you can do one simple climate control function without going into the screen, and that is adjusting the temperature. You do that by swiping your finger on this little pad here. This one over on the driver's side adjusts the driver's side temperature, and this pad over on the passenger side adjusts the passenger side temperature, and that works reasonably well, but just for that one function. Now, it's worth pointing out you can also use this pad to turn on the heated seats if you tap with two fingers at once. You can see I tap here and it turns on the heated seat, but it doesn't really work all that well. As you can see, I'm tapping and only like 1 out of every 3 taps is actually received and actually has any effect on turning the heated seat on or changing the amount of heat. Also, this car has cooled seats, but you can't turn them on with that double tap method. You got to go into the climate screen. The double tap only brings up the heated seat for some reason, so it's not really that great of an integration for that or any of the climate control features in this car. Now, another big issue with this infotainment system is the screen simply isn't large enough in the center. The reason the climate controls don't have their own little fixed portion of the screen at the bottom, like in a lot of cars, is there just isn't room. And that also means there's not enough room to show multiple things at once on this screen, which is a big complaint, because if you have the climate screen up, for example, but you want to change the radio station, you gotta X out of the climate screen, then go to the radio, change the station, and then you can go back into the climate screen and pull it back up and have your climate controls ready. You can't ever do multiple things in this screen. It's simply too small for that. If only they could make it bigger somehow. If only there was some massive hole at the bottom of the center control stack that they could have used to enlarge the screen or add climate controls. Wouldn't that be nice? It's amazing to me they jammed everything into this tiny screen and left this huge hole here where a couple of extra inches really mattered in this interior. However, I should note there are some big technology pluses or benefits with this car, and the primary one is the gauge cluster screen. I love this gauge cluster screen. It's way better than what you find in a lot of rivals for this price point. You can see it's a full screen and it is very configurable. You have, for instance, the radio display right here, so you can see what's playing, and of course you can change it on the steering wheel, and that takes some of the pressure off of having to change everything in the center screen, which is too small. You can also have the gauge cluster display show a full screen map, which is very useful, of course. You can see the whole thing in here, which again takes some of the necessity out of having to use the center screen for everything. Obviously the passenger doesn't have access to the gauge display, but it is a useful solution to kind of the problematic center screen. Also worth noting in this gauge cluster screen, in addition to the stereo display and the map view, there's also this cool performance view. You can see the tachometer gets very large and GTI is highlighted right in the center. Not especially high tech, this screen, but it does look pretty cool, and that's a nice feature to have. I like the configurability of this cluster. There's also some cool tech features in this car. For instance, you can configure the ambient lighting in this car, which isn't something you often see at this price point. You can choose between these various lighting moods for interior lighting, and you can even select your own personal lighting, not just a mood, but actually choose the specific color you want, which is pretty cool. Again, not often seen at this price point. I also love the fact that this infotainment screen in the center displays more information as your fingers get closer. It has like some finger detection system, and as you're getting closer, it pops up more stuff, as you can see, and that goes away for a cleaner display when your fingers aren't nearby, and then it pops back up when your fingers get close, and I think that is just a neat little trick. Certainly doesn't forgive the flaws of this system, but it does make it a little bit more endearing. Now, finally, on the topic of this screen, another drawback here, I mentioned that you adjust the climate control temperature with these little sliders below the screen, and it's the same deal with stereo volume. You swipe your hand over this pad in the center to adjust the stereo volume up or down instead of like a traditional stereo knob. There's been a lot of criticism that these sliders aren't lighted at night, and that's true, although frankly I think that is a overblown criticism. There's only 3 sliders and it's very easy to figure out which is which based on where they're positioned. I think the bigger problem is that these sliders exist at all. It'd be so much easier to have regular buttons for climate control and a knob for the volume, but Volkswagen did this to save money. It's cheaper to put in these sliders and integrate everything else into the software rather than manufacture physical knobs, dials, switches, buttons for stereo and climate controls. And that brings us to our number 2 flaw with the new GTI, which would be cost cutting. Volkswagen did that stuff to be cheaper, but there's other obvious cost cutting in here as well. Like on the door panels, you can see this cheap plastic just doesn't really look all that nice. Same deal on the dashboard. You again have a cheap plastic surface at the top, and there's cheap plastic in a lot of other places too. The center console has 2 different types of cheap plastic next to each other. It just doesn't really look all that great. Now, you might be thinking, well, compact car, relatively cheap, who cares about the materials? But one major advantage the GTI has had over its rivals historically has been kind of a slightly budget Audi interior. You were paying more, getting less horsepower, but you were getting a nicer, more luxurious car, and that advantage has certainly eroded a bit with the newer model. It just feels a little cheaper in here. Now, admittedly, there's still are a few like luxury feeling advantages in this interior over some of the rivals. For instance, the steering wheel. It looks good, it feels good, it has this sort of perforated leather on the sides, GTI on the bottom. It all is pretty nice. Same deal with the seats. They look pretty nice, sporty seats, different colors, contrast stitching, and that looks pretty cool as well. I also like the capacitive touch buttons on the steering wheel. Some people complain about capacitive touch. I'm not one of those. I think if done right, it can look good, and this does. It looks good and feels premium, which is nice. Also, to the left of the steering wheel, you have this sort of capacitive touch button pad for the headlights and the defogger and defroster, and I think that also has a premium feel to it. It seems kind of Audi-esque in this relatively inexpensive Volkswagen interior. But anyway, with some of this car's flaws out of the way, I now want to move on to its quirks and features, starting right here in the center with the manual transmission. You can still get an automatic in this car. A dual clutch automatic is about $800 extra, but the manual is obviously the cool way to go. It has a nice looking shift lever, as you can see, although a bit of a disappointment, the golf ball shift lever is gone. It felt good, and it was always funny to see a golf ball in a Golf, and so I'm sad they got rid of that, except they didn't. It's hidden. If you go around to the front, you can still see the golf ball indentations on the shift lever to mimic GTI models of old, which I think is a cool little touch. Also, another interesting quirk in this interior, there really is capacitive touch buttons for everything. They've gotten rid of virtually all traditional buttons in here, and that includes the dome lights. You can see on the ceiling, this panel, you tap this capacitive touch button panel to turn on the dome lights rather than an actual button up here. Even the sunroof control is capacitive touch. To open the sunroof, you slide your finger over this panel, and then the sunroof opens in the direction that you slid your finger. You can see I slide it back, the sunroof opens, I slide it forward, the sunroof closes. Capacitive touch for everything in this interior. And by the way, speaking of the sunroof, one interesting Volkswagen quirk, you can open the sunroof and leave the mesh sunshade closed in the sunroof area. So you can have the air blowing in here, but keep the sunshade closed to keep the sunlight out. This is unique to Volkswagen and Audi models. I haven't seen it anywhere else. I used to think it was kind of weird, but I've come around to it, and I actually kind of like that they can do this. And next up, we move outside the new GTI, where you can see the styling. Simple, restrained styling like always. That's always been a hallmark of the GTI. While some compact car rivals have gone insane with their wings and intakes and all that stuff, the GTI has always remained relatively simple and under the radar, which I think is a benefit to this car. Now, there are some cool exterior styling touches with this car, and the fog lights are unquestionably the coolest. You can see this lower grille in front is just a bunch of hexagons going across the entire front of the car. But when you turn on the fog lights, 5 of the hexagons light up on each side in kind of a cool pattern. I absolutely love how this looks, and I really wish this had been the running lights for this car. Unfortunately, because it's the fog lights, you have to actually turn on the headlights and the fog lights in order to see this cool design, and I think a lot of people aren't gonna do that just so onlookers can see these cool fog lights. Frankly, I think the coolest design feature of this car will probably never really be seen by most people, but it is cool. And by the way, speaking of the headlights in this car, there is a front light bar in the new GTI. You turn on the headlights and you can see the light bar going across the front and sort of connecting the headlights. Rear light bars have become pretty common, but fronts are starting to get out there too, and this car has one. But anyway, next up we move on to the back of the new GTI, which, as you can see, has kind of a simpler, cleaner look than the front. Although first, I want to touch on the key, which is also very simple and clean. You can see the VW logo, this piano black trim, looks kind of futuristic. You flip it over and you don't have like traditional buttons. These almost look capacitive touch, although they aren't. They are actual real buttons on the key, but it is very elegant and cool, this key. But anyway, back to the rear end of this car, a couple of interesting things worth noting. For one, not much badging back here. You have the old school GTI logo right in the center, borrowed from the old models, which is a neat touch to see that throwback. And you also have the VW logo here, although you'll notice there's no trunk handle in back. It's so simple and uninterrupted. That's because the VW logo is the trunk handle. When the car is unlocked, you walk up and you push the top and then pull the bottom and that is your tailgate handle, which is a really, really cool feature. Interestingly, this is also your backup camera. You shift the car into reverse and you can see the VW logo pops out, and there is the backup camera pointing down, showing what's behind you. And of course, that image goes to the center screen. Very cool integration, and it keeps the rear end looking clean and simple. Now, a few other items worth noting back here. For one, you have dual exhausts in the back, which look kind of cool and performance-y, and they sound okay, not amazing, but pretty good. Take a listen. But anyway, also notable, of course, is getting into the back and the cargo area back here. You lift up the tailgate and you can see the cargo area is actually pretty standard. Nothing unusual or interesting back here. It's not really larger or smaller than you might expect for this type of car. It's exactly what you'd want, a practical hatchback cargo area from a hot hatchback. One interesting thing though, on the inside of the tailgate, you can see there's like this hole that doesn't really look very high quality or professional. That's where the warning triangle is supposed to go on European GTI models. In Europe, a warning triangle is mandated to be sold in all new cars, but in the States that mandate doesn't exist, so they just pull it out and leave that hole there. Doesn't really look all that nice, but that's what they do. And next up, we have under the hood, where we have a turbocharged 4-cylinder that makes about 240 horsepower and about 275 pound-feet of torque. Both of those figures are up from the prior model, about 15 more horses and 15 more pound-feet, which is pretty good. And Volkswagen also says the new GTI is about 30 pounds lighter than before. Obviously, 30 pounds is pretty insignificant, but it's better than being heavier than before, which is the direction most new cars are going. Now, obviously, this GTI is equipped with a manual transmission, but if you get the dual clutch, this car is surprisingly quick. Low 5 seconds 0 to 60, which is a pretty decent time for a vehicle with only 240 horsepower that starts around $30,000. And next up, we move on to the back seat in the new GTI, which is surprisingly good. Now, when I say that, I'm not referring to rear seat room, because it is pretty cramped back here, although that is kind of standard for a car like this. A hot hatchback adds some practicality, but it's not going to be huge. If you want a big sedan or an SUV, you'll have to get one. So it's acceptably sized back here, but not massive. Instead, it is surprisingly good in other ways. For instance, it looks pretty nice back here. The rear seats also have this two-tone material like in front and the contrast stitching, and that's a pretty nice touch for rear passengers. You also have rear seat climate control back here, which is a real shock at this price point. Not too many cars like this have this feature. You can't adjust the fan speed, but you can adjust the temperature of the air back here, and you have your own climate vents, which really is a nice touch. And you have heated rear seats back here, which helps you adjust your comfortability even further. It's really nice to see in a car like this. I also really like the storage pockets on the back of the front seats. You have one kind of normal full-size storage pocket, you can see here on the bottom, but you also have two little upper storage pockets that are perfectly sized for you to put a smartphone when you're sitting back here, which is a nice idea to have those several different compartments. And speaking of smartphones, you also get two built-in chargers back here. You can see two USB-C ports in the center, which makes charging your devices easy. So all that stuff makes for a pretty nice back seat in the new GTI. Now, next up, I want to move on to two other interesting items before I go drive the new GTI. One is the market position of this car. This used to be the high-performance version of the Volkswagen Golf, but now Volkswagen is no longer selling the Golf here in North America. That led to some fears that they were going to cancel the GTI and the Golf R, but they haven't yet. However, this is no longer the high-performance version of anything, since there's no base model Golf below this car. Kind of interesting. Americans have always preferred sedans, and so the Jetta will be our compact Volkswagen going forward. I also want to discuss this car's pricing. Like I said, it starts right around $30,000, a little over, like $30,500. But if you get a really well-equipped GTI like this one is, you can get into the low $40,000 range. At that point, you're kind of knocking on the door of the Volkswagen Golf R, which starts around $44,500. So people who are getting highly equipped GTIs might instead want to look at the Golf R. The Golf R has 315 horsepower, which is a 75 horsepower advantage over this car, and of course all-wheel drive and a few other cool performance features that might help to justify the extra pricing over a higher-end version of the GTI. And so those are the quirks and features of the new Volkswagen GTI. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the new GTI. This car is very interesting in a lot of ways. And I've talked a lot about its flaws, and specifically the flaws with technology and the interior quality, which I think are pretty obvious to just about anyone who's got some experience with this car. But this car really shines when you get behind the wheel. You know, I got in this car and I looked around and I thought, oh, this isn't that nice. And I know the screen from the Golf R, and so I knew that would be a bit of a challenge. And I just had kind of low expectations. And then I drove it. And this car is still a ton of fun. You know, the GTI has always been a pretty thrilling and exciting and fun car. And there were some generations in there that weren't quite as nice. But since about 06, 07, the Mark V, I owned one of those. And since then, that has kind of been like the reemergence of the GTI. And this car has its drawbacks, but man, first off, the acceleration, 240 horsepower, $30,000. That's a pretty good dollar to horsepower range to begin with. It's not as good as some of the rivals, but it's pretty good. But then when you actually get on it, it feels quick. Like, it is a responsive powertrain, and it feels quick, and it drives quick. And I love, love, love dropping the throttle in this car. It's a lot quicker than you might expect. Then you have the gear lever situation. This manual's transmission is just fantastic. The clutch is really, it's light, it's not too light, but it's very linear, very easy to figure out, and the shifter is just wonderfully weighted. It's not quite like it is in like a Porsche or a true high-performance sports car, a new M3, but for a compact, you know, fun car, it's great. It's got some weight on the top, it feels good, easy to put into gear, not too rubbery, not too notchy. It's excellent. Then you have the handling prowess of this car, and I gotta say, that is pretty impressive as well. For a front-wheel drive car, it's always been looked at as a big penalty, and it is here too, even in comparison to its Golf R sibling, but it is quick and precise. The steering is tremendously precise, very impressively so. It's a very immediate car, like a lot of these compact hatchbacks really aren't. And I love kind of steering it and putting it through the corners. The body is very composed, not much body roll, despite the fact that this has gotten to be a pretty large car over the years. It's fun and eager to go and be thrown around. And thus, it is kind of a conundrum, this car. It's a little bit of a disappointment in the sense that it's so good to drive and it's let down by some unfortunate, confusing technology and cost cutting in this interior. I will say, and I do want to make this point, I didn't touch on it that much earlier, the infotainment system isn't that bad. The climate control portion is bad. It's a disappointment and it's not easy to use. But the rest of it, you figure it out and you get used to it. The interior in this car does not hold a significant advantage over the new WRX or even over the Elantra N, both of which I recently reviewed in the last month. So I've had the ability to really compare these cars, and this car is better, but not that much better. But it does have a lot of cool benefits. It's really attractive and it drives so nicely. Now, I do want to point out, I think the new WRX actually drives a little better. It feels a little quicker and it pushes through corners a little better. Steering is even more precise, handling is fantastic in the new WRX, and it's great. But there are a lot of good reasons not to buy the new WRX. It is not a particularly attractive car, this certainly is. And frankly, the tech in the new WRX is not exactly great. This car's gauge cluster screen is on a totally different and better level than that. Also, there's no hatchback version of the WRX if that appeals to you. So the WRX drives better and it does have some advantages, but this car is plenty appealing as well. And I just am disappointed about the tech situation in this car and the interior quality situation, because it's a brilliant GTI. It just could be a little bit better, and that little bit gives the rivals an open door to come in and provide legitimately good alternatives. And I think the Elantra N and the WRX are good alternatives to this car, even though there's so much going for the GTI. And so that's the new Volkswagen GTI. I really like driving this car, more than I expected that I would. It's fast, it's fun, it feels light on its feet, quick to move around. Honestly, this might be my very favorite GTI from a driving perspective. It's just a shame that it's let down by a downgraded interior and a questionable infotainment system. Still, that's the new GTI, and now it's time to give it a DOUGSCORE.
And the DOUGSCORE is here, 57 out of 100, which places the GTI surprisingly high in good company against more powerful cars like the Elantra N and the new Subaru WRX. The reason the GTI scores so well is it's such a good all-rounder. It's not as fun as the WRX, but it's certainly more attractive. It's not as fast as the Elantra N, but it's certainly more practical thanks to the hatchback body style. Frankly, the new GTI is an excellent car, with its only real letdown being that disappointing infotainment system.